Would you believe me if I told you that in Skyrim this beggar makes more money than a farmer? I wouldn't either, but after doing some thinking and solving some extremely difficult math equations, it turns out to be true. And to my surprise, the whole economy in this game is way more complex than it might seem at first. Just think about it. There are over 1,000 people living in the land of Skyrim, and every single one of them has to provide for themselves. They need food, they need housing, and of course they need money. But how much money do they need? And where does the money come from? The game never tells you these details. But what if I told you that there is a way, actually multiple ways to estimate that? So today, I will walk you through the economy of Skyrim to figure out how much money people actually make. We are going to start at the very bottom with beggars, work our way up through farmers, average people, business owners, and finally end it with none other than Jarls. With that being said, let's take a look at our first group. Beggars. You have probably seen them a bunch of times while walking around the cities. They are the lowest and the poorest stratum of Skyrim's population. And since they have no job and no official income, they resort to, well, begging. And that creates the first problem. Technically, there is no way to measure their income. And since it's impossible to determine how much money people are giving them, let's pretend that 10% of the city's population gives them a set amount of 1 septim every day. But how much is that? To find out, we need to count every resident in the 5 major cities. And after spending some time looking through the wiki and walking around those cities, here are the results. In Whiterun, there are a total of 102 people, with 5 of them being children and 1 being a beggar, Brenuin. I'm pointing them out because children don't really have any money to give away, and Brenuin is the beggar. So that comes out to 96 adults that can actually donate their money. Riften has the highest population among the major cities with 122 people. 3 of them are prisoners in the Mistvale Keep jail, 7 are children, and 2, Edda and Sniff, are beggars. That leaves us with 110 adults that qualify as being able to donate their money. In Markarth there are 114 people, with 7 of them being prisoners, 3 being children, and 1 being a beggar. The gain. That gives us a grand total of 103 adults who are able to donate their money. The imperial capital Solitude houses a total of 112 people, 1 of them being a prisoner, 8 being children, and 2, Noster, Eagle-Eye, and Dervanin, being beggars. That gives us 101 adults who can donate their money. The northern capital Windhelm surprisingly has the lowest population of only 88 people, with 5 of them being children and 2, Angrenor Once Honored and Silded the Unseen, being beggars. That leaves us with 81 adults who can donate their money. Now with that in mind, we can actually estimate a beggar's income. To do that, we just need to divide the number of donors in each city by 10, then divide the number again by the number of beggars in the city, and then multiply it by 30 to get their monthly income. And after doing some math, here are the results. Windhelm comes last with an average income of 122 septims per beggar. Not far from it comes Solitude with an average income of 152 septims, and Riften with an income of 165 septims per beggar. Whiterun has an average income of 288 septims, and Markarth takes the first place with a whopping income of 309 septims per beggar. So if you want to be homeless, Markarth is your choice. But make sure you get rid of all the competitors first. Now let's take a look at the beggars' expenses. Since they don't own anything and are not paying rent, the only expenses they have are food and alcohol. Their ration most likely consists of the cheapest calorie-dense foods, those being potatoes and bread. A loaf of bread and 1 potato cost 6 septims and are barely enough to get you through your day. Sometimes beggars might find some leftover food from other people, but that's if they're lucky. This ration comes out to 180 septims a month, and as we can see, some beggars can't even afford something like this, while others have a great surplus of more than 100 septims. But even if there is some leftover money, it is immediately spent on alcohol. So beggars are not making any monthly profits and obviously cannot save up for something like renting a house, or in most cases, even a room. Now let's take a look at our next group of people. Farmers. At first you might think that since farmers have land and grow their own crops, they must be making at least some money. And while that is true every now and then, most farmers actually don't make any profit whatsoever. See, most of their income comes from selling their harvest, and there is not a lot of it. And by not a lot, I mean barely any. For example, let's take the Battleborn farm near Whiterun. On their territory, they have 6 stacks of wheat, 18 leeks, 5 gourds, 3 chickens, and 1 cow. And that's it. That is not even enough to feed the people working on the farm, let alone to sell it in the market. And surprisingly, most other farms have even less harvest. Take a look at Salvia's farm near Markarth. All they have here are 4 chickens and 16 potato plants. They do have some haystacks here, which are most likely a fresh harvest since there are no other wheat plants here. They also have some juniper berries and other unknown plants growing straight out of the roof of their house, which is absolutely not weird and intended. But nothing comes close to Hlalo farm. They are not only located in one of the coldest parts of Skyrim that is permanently covered in snow, but their whole harvest consists of only 6 wheat plants. This farm is basically producing nothing. So, how much money do these people make? Let's take a look at the numbers. We have already established that the most part of the harvest goes back onto the farmer's table. But where does the rest go? Taxes. Yes, even in Skyrim, you cannot run away from them. Historically, since most of the farmers didn't have a lot of money, they have been paying their taxes with their harvest. So only after that, if there is some surplus left, it is sold to city markets or used in trade. And here's the thing. The absence of money is not a huge problem for farmers. Of course, they are not living a lavish life, but for the most part, they are self-sufficient. They already have a farmhouse to live in, make their own food, and gather their own firewood. The only times they might need money is buying new tools at the blacksmith or something in the city market. But their self-sufficiency brings a lot of risks. Just think about it. If there is a bad harvest or an early frost kills all the crops, the farmer is left with no food and no potential income. So a farmer's income is very unstable and most of the time barely exists. Since there is no way to perfectly measure their income, we can roughly estimate that it comes out to somewhere between 0 and 100 septims per month. Their expenses fall into a similar range, which means that their profit is just as unpredictable. Some months they might break even, some months they might lose a little, and on the rare occasion, if everything goes right, they might actually come out with a small profit. Now, let's go back into the city walls and talk about the ordinary citizens. These are your average people who make up most of the city's population. Guards, carriage drivers, miners, or bards and waiters in the taverns. And even though their jobs are different, all of them are very similar to each other. They are all employed by someone else and survive by working a day-to-day job. And that creates a problem. How can we establish a tavern assistant's or bard's income if they're getting paid by the inn owner? And the simple answer is, we can't. But what we can do instead is do some reverse engineering and find out how much money an average person needs to spend. That will establish some kind of minimum wage that we can go off of. Let's start by looking at their most important expense, food. We have already established a beggar's ration, but it is barely enough to get through the day. Ordinary citizens' meals are clearly way more diverse and include different vegetables, meats, pastry, and maybe even occasional ale. Their breakfast must be light, so something like bread with an egg or a potato. For lunch and dinner, they would have something like meat with vegetables or some type of stew. In total, that comes out to around 20 septims per day, or 600 septims per month. After getting some food, they need to find a place to sleep. Most people like assistants and bards are usually provided with a room by their employer, and don't have to pay any money for it. But others have to rent out a room or rely on public housing projects like Helga's bunkhouse in Riften. With the price of rent of 10 septims per night, that comes out to 300 septims per month. But as we can see, the housing situation with ordinary citizens is very uncertain. So let's say that the housing expense will be in the range from 0 to 300 septims per month. And since we are establishing the bare minimum for survival, I will not be counting any other minor expenses. So with that being said, the total minimal cost of living comes out to 600 to 900 septims per month. Now that we set a baseline for Skyrim's minimum wage, we can finally estimate how much money an average person makes. I doubt that they're getting paid the absolute minimum, so I would assume that they're earning somewhere in the range from 700 to 1000 septims per month. Now let's take this amount and compare it to some people's wages that I can actually estimate to see if it makes sense, or if I just made shit up. Let's start with the carriage driver. He is probably getting paid a cut of what he earns, or maybe even a wage. But for the sake of the video, let's say that he keeps the full 100% of money he makes from fares. He has 8 destinations, with 4 of them costing 50 septims and the other 4 costing 20 septims. With the size of Skyrim, if he works full-time, he can probably do around 20 fairs per month. With the average cost of 35 septims per fair, that comes out to a crisp 700 septims per month, which falls perfectly into the previously established range. Now, let's take a look at city guards. And you might say, but guards are getting paid wages, how can you estimate them? And the answer is bread. See, in the medieval times, guards were making around 2 pence per day. With that money, they could afford a whopping 8 loaves of bread, which cost around a quarter of a penny. Now, if we take these numbers and translate them into Skyrim's economy, with the price of bread of 4 septims, that comes out to 32 septims per day. Now, just multiply it by 30, and we get 960 septims per month. And of course, the bread comparison doesn't give us the most accurate amount, but that's as close as it gets. Now that we have a rough estimate of how much an average person makes and spends, we can find out how much monthly profit they actually make. Most people that earn minimum wage have around 100 to 400 septims per month, depending on their housing situation. A carriage driver doesn't rent a room and probably sleeps at the stalls. And after all expenses, he takes home only 100 septims. Guards, on the other hand, have around 500 septims after all their expenses, since they are being provided with a bed in the barracks and some necessary foods. And that concludes it for average people. Now let's take a step up and look at business owners. There are all types of businesses in Skyrim, from market stalls to all kinds of stores to inns and taverns. Let's start with the smallest one of them, market stalls. And there is no better place to do it than at the Whiterun marketplace. Here we have a food vendor, a butcher, and a jewelry merchant. Let's start with the food vendor, in our case Carlotta. We know what she's selling and the price of her items, but here's a question. How much does she sell daily? To answer that, we need to find out how she stores her goods, because she's selling vegetables, and vegetables spoil pretty quickly if not stored in the right conditions. So after breaking into her house and not seeing a root cellar or even any barrels, we will have to assume that she stores everything at the market stall. Which is pretty dumb, but if we come to the city market at night, we can even see that everything is still on display, so that seems to be the case. That means that she has to get rid of her stock pretty quick before the food starts to spoil. Let's say that she sells everything in 2 days. If we combine the prices of all of her items and divide that number by 2, we will get an income of roughly 115 septims per day or 3,450 septims per month. As we can see, that is more than triple the income of an ordinary person. Now let's compare it to the nearby butcher Anoriath. He sells meat, so in his case he has to sell his whole stock in 1 day before it spoils. And we could just take that as a daily income, but he mentions that he hunts for his food himself. That means that he spends a big portion of his time outside of his stall, even though we don't actually see it. So let's say that he's working on the city market for 15 days out of the month. Taking the price of his stock, his daily income comes out to roughly 120 septims. That gives us a monthly income of 1,800 septims, which is seemingly 50% lower than Carlotta's revenue. I will not be looking at the jewelry merchant next to them since it's realistically impossible to know how much of her stock she sells. She might sell all of it or absolutely nothing, and there is no way to tell. Now let's go into the inn next to them and take a look at the innkeepers. In our case, Hulda. Fun fact, I didn't know this, but if she dies under some mysterious circumstances, she gets replaced by Isolde, who for a long time wanted to purchase the Bennett Mare. I think it's amazing how, after playing this game for almost 10 years, I still find something that I didn't know about. But let's get back to the numbers. Innkeepers' 2 main sources of income are selling food and drinks and renting out a room that allows travelers passing through or just people with no home to get some rest. And I saw some people saying that there are actually multiple rooms that they're renting out, since this inn has a total of 4 rooms. But that's just wrong, since the room on the first floor belongs to the innkeeper, Hulda, and the 2 rooms on the second floor belong to the bard, Mikael, and the assistant, Sadia. So yes, there's only 1 rentable room in this inn, and it's the easiest type of income to estimate. I'm going to assume that this room is always occupied, which gives us 10 septims per day or 300 septims per month. And to be honest, that is incredibly cheap, because I feel like they could easily charge at least 25 septims per night. But I guess they can afford to price it like this. Now, estimating the income from food and drinks is a bit trickier, because once again, we don't know how much food they are selling. But let's just say that every person that visits this inn buys a meal and a drink. A bottle of ale costs 11 septims, and with the food prices we previously covered, a normal meal would be something around 15 septims. That means that every patron that comes into this inn spends 26 septims. That gives us a daily income of 260 septims from food sales and 10 septims from renting out a room. If we combine everything, that gives us a revenue of 270 septims per day or 8,100 septims per month. Now, before talking about the expenses, let's take a look at the last type of businesses: stores. There are all kinds of stores in Skyrim, from trophy and trinket stores, to potion shops, to expensive clothing boutiques. But for the sake of keeping it simple, let's just go across the street from the Bennett Mare and take a look at Bellator's General Goods. As the name states, it is a general goods store, which is probably the best store to look at since the owner sells basically everything. The problem with stores in Skyrim is they don't have any customers. It is always just the owner and his assistant, and that's it. So if we are looking at it from this perspective, they're not making any money whatsoever. But realistically, we could make an assumption that a store owner makes roughly a third of innkeeper's income. And that seems pretty reasonable, because in comparison to food, people don't buy gold horns and plates every day. Translating into numbers, that comes out to around 2,700 septims. And that concludes the revenues of business owners. Now, how much of that money are they actually putting into their pocket? First, let's take a look at the market vendors and compare them. Both of them pay 600 septims per month for their food. Carlotta owns a house that she inherited from her husband, so she doesn't need to rent out a room to sleep. Anoriath lives in the Drunken Huntsman, a tavern he and his brother Elrindir own, so he also doesn't need to pay for accommodation. Both of them have to pay around 5% of their revenue as a stallage fee for having their stalls in the city market. They both have to restock, but here's the difference. Carlotta doesn't grow any vegetables, so she buys them in bulk, which sets her back around 60% of her revenue. And as we know, Anoriath hunts for his food himself. That creates a big gap between them, with Carlotta's profit being around 608 septims, and Anoriath's profit being a whopping 1,110 septims per month. Of course, they have other personal expenses like maintaining their houses and Carlotta feeding her child, but that's too much to go into. Now, let's move on to the rest of the business owners. The most obvious and the biggest expense they have is their business. Restocking, paying wages, buying firewood, and maintaining your business in shape usually comes out to around 60% of the revenue per month. They would also need to pay an income tax of around 10% of their revenue. They both have a place to sleep, and all that is left is a food expense of 600 septims. That gives an innkeeper a profit of 1,830 septims and a store owner a profit of measly 210 septims per month. By my calculations, that means that being a butcher or an innkeeper are two most profitable business schemes in Skyrim. Now, with all of these people out of the way, we have come to our last destination. Probably some of the richest people in all of Skyrim. Jarls. In total, there are 9 of them, 1 for each hold. Since I'm only covering major cities, I'm only going to talk about their Jarls. Let's start in the center with Whiterun. To estimate how much money a Jarl makes, we yet again need to find out their expenses first. Let's start with the easiest one of them to cover. Wages. Now for a second, think about how many employees a Jarl has. First he has to pay a steward and a court mage. After that come assistants and maids. And after all of that, he still has to pay wages to every single guard in the city. That's a lot of money. Both steward and court mage make probably 3 to 4 times the salary of a city guard. So somewhere around 4,000 septims per month. Assistants and maids are probably getting paid with housing and food, but I'm sure that they're getting at least some money, so let's just say that's another 1,000. Every guard is getting paid 960 septims per month. With 28 guards in Whiterun, in total Jarl Balgruuf has to pay them 26,880 septims. At the end, the Jarl of Whiterun has to spend 35,880 septims only paying out wages to his workers. And sadly, that is the only expense that is possible to estimate. Jarl also has to spend his money on the city itself, keeping it in good shape with all the roads and houses intact. Then there are import expenses, personal expenses, and all the minor stuff. For the sake of estimation, let's just throw a random number out. 20,000 for all of these expenses. That means that in total, Jarl Balgruuf has to spend 55,880 septims every month to keep his city running. Now, how do we estimate the income? The answer is we can't. We can roughly get the amount of money he gets from people paying taxes, but that's it. There is no way to find out how much he gets from export or trading tariffs. Short answer, he has to make more money than he spends, or the city would have fallen apart. So I would estimate his income to be somewhere around 60 to 70,000 septims per month. Now, what about other Jarls? The only noticeable difference between their expenses are the guards' wages, since there are different numbers of guards in each city. In Riften and Markarth there are 28 guards, so the wage spending is exactly the same as in Whiterun. Solitude has 30 guards, which is more than any other city in Skyrim. Their wages come out to 28,800 septims. And last but not least, Windhelm has only 20 guards, which is crazy to me because it is literally the northern capital. Those 20 guards set Ulfric Stormcloak back only 19,200 septims per month. In conclusion, most Jarls make and spend roughly the same amount of money, the only exception being Ulfric Stormcloak, with Windhelm having the least people and guards across all Skyrim cities. Which means that he has to spend the least, but also makes the least money out of all Jarls, which technically makes him the poorest major city Jarl in Skyrim. And now with Jarls out of the way, that concludes our list. Well, there is actually someone else that I want to cover, that being none other but Dovahkiin himself. There is no tax bracket in Skyrim to measure his income because he just completely shits on the game's economy. Literally all this Jordan Belfort needs is some salmon roe, Nordic barnacles and garlic, and the whole world economy is doomed. Even at the very start of your journey, just one quick trip to the Bleak Falls Barrow is going to make you more than someone's monthly wage. It is absolutely ridiculous how much money the protagonist makes. And I'm not even going to start on the speech skill tree that amplifies his income even further. But now, with that being said, we have finally reached the end. If I got something wrong or had some mistakes in my math, feel free to correct me in the comment section below. Or don't. See you next time.